My name is Judy, and I am 32 years old, and when I look back on the path that brought me here, to this quiet, cozy house full of sunlight and the chirping of birds in the morning, it is hard to believe that it all started with a simple dream, with a laptop sitting on an old table in a stuffy dorm room, where I first discovered programming. Back then, I had no idea how to write code, didn't know the difference between Java and Python, but I had one thing: persistence. I studied at night, fell asleep over textbooks, and spent sleepless hours in front of the screen, trying again and again, until finally I began to understand how working programs are born from strings of characters. 3 years ago, for the first time, I felt that all this effort was not in vain. That's when I was able to afford to buy a house, not just an apartment somewhere on the outskirts, but a real house, with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, a well-kept yard and, what is especially important for me, a separate room that I turned into an ideal workspace. This room has large windows, soft, diffused light and complete silence. This is where I spend most of my weekdays, sitting in my pajamas, with a cup of coffee and a laptop, immersing myself in the world of code. I work for a company that produces security systems, smart cameras, motion sensors, voice control, phone integration, all this technological luxury that now seems ordinary to us. The funniest thing is that I wrote most of the software for these systems. I know every byte, every line of code, because they are my brainchild, my second wind. My boss adores me. Firstly, I don't ask for help. Secondly, I'm never late because I work from home. And thirdly, because I always do everything on time. My salary allows me to live a stress-free life, and I've learned to appreciate this peace. My day is well established. Wake up at 8, coffee with a little cinnamon, work hard until 6, then something simple for dinner, sometimes ordering from a restaurant, a little Netflix before bed. On weekends, I clean, go grocery shopping, maybe treat myself to a book or a new TV series. I don't like drama, I never have. I tried to keep my life under control, every detail of it, and I succeeded. Right after I bought this house, I, of course, installed our own security systems, cameras in every room, sensors along the perimeter, smart locks, an alarm that is impossible to fool. Everything worked like clockwork. In fact, I wrote my own program that connects all these devices and allows me to monitor the house literally from the screen of my phone. Want to know if the light is on in the kitchen? Or who is at the door? I can see everything even when I'm thousands of miles away. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a movie about the future, only this is my present. True, I never told my family about this. I knew how they would react. They would start laughing, like, paranoid. Why do you need so many cameras? Who are you afraid of? But it's not about fear. I just like order. I like knowing that everything is under control. This is my way of dealing with anxiety. I observe the world without disturbing it, but knowing that if something goes wrong, I will notice it first. And everything was going swimmingly, until one day I got a call from my sister Sarah. She is 35, 3 years older than me. She has 2 sons, Jake, a restless dreamer of 9, and Tommy, a silent 7-year-old with amazingly intelligent eyes. Their father left 2 years ago. He left Sarah alone with the children and, classic, ran off with some waitress half his age. Since then, he has not appeared and has not even paid child support. I tried to help out. I paid her rent, bought clothes for the nephews, and sometimes sent food. I never thought of it as anything out of the ordinary. She was my sister, and the kids, well, they needed a roof over their heads. When she called that evening, her voice was especially strained. "Judy, I need to talk to you about something," she said, and there was something anxious in her tone, as if she were about to tell me something important but didn't know where to start. "Is it okay if we come over to your house on Saturday?" The boys miss their aunt. I smiled. I missed her too. They were loud, sometimes tiring, but their energy, their lightheartedness, always warmed me. They reminded me that life wasn't all code and reports, but laughter and ice cream and pranks and the soft embrace of little hands. "Sure, come over, I'll cook something delicious," I said, and Saturday immediately became meaningful. In the morning, I cleaned the house, wiped down all the surfaces, washed the floor, went to the store and bought everything my nephews like: fruit bars, strawberries, cereal with colorful balls, juices with funny straws. While I was making sandwiches for lunch, I heard Sarah's car pull up to my house. I dried my hands, went out onto the porch and froze. Instead of a light bag or backpacks, I saw Sarah pulling huge suitcases out of the trunk, the kind that people take with them when they're not visiting, but moving. There were boxes next to her, sealed and taped. This wasn't just a visit. "Hey, guys," I called, trying to keep my voice cheerful, although something inside me was painfully clenching. Jake and Tommy immediately ran up to me, hugging me tightly, their faces shining with joy. "Aunt Judy, look, we brought all our stuff," Tommy exclaimed happily, pointing to the luggage, which now seemed even larger. "All your stuff, I whispered, feeling anxiety starting to rise inside. Sarah was already dragging one of the bags to the front door. "Boys, help me with the boxes," she threw over her shoulder, as if everything had been decided in advance. I followed them inside, my heart pounding in my chest as if I'd just run a marathon and not just seen suitcases on my doorstep. The air felt thicker, as if the tension in the room could be cut with a knife. Sarah was running my house with the calmness of someone who'd always lived there. She gave the boys instructions to unpack the boxes in the living room, her tone so confident that I couldn't help but feel like a guest in my own home. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Jake and Tommy obediently lugged the boxes along without asking a single question. "Sarah, what's going on?" I finally managed, forcing my voice to remain level even as confusion bubbled inside. "This isn't just a weekend visit, right?" She straightened up, pushed a strand of hair out of her face, and looked at me with that expression I remembered so well from when I was a child. Her face hardened, her chin jutting out a little, and a stubbornness in her eyes that was so familiar and so unpleasant. I knew I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. "I've moved out of the apartment," she said calmly, as if she were talking about something as mundane as buying bread. "We're going to live here with you. You have 3 empty bedrooms, the boys need stability, and I need help. You work from home anyway, so you can keep an eye on them while I'm busy." I felt the blood drain from my face. No, Sarah, of course not," I said, taking a step forward. "I'll help you find another apartment, pay for the first month if you need to, but you can't just up and move in with me without my permission." A look of irritation crossed Sarah's face. As if she already knew I wasn't going to go down without a fight. She didn't answer, but instead pulled out her phone without looking at me and dialed a number. "Hi, Mom, it's Sarah," she said, her voice deliberately calm, almost deliberately cheerful. "Yes, we're in New York, as discussed." "Yes, she's a little difficult, talk to her." And before I could process what was happening, she thrust the phone at me, forcing me to take up this strange baton. "Judy, honey, what's wrong?" Mom's voice was warm, but with a note of alarm that immediately made me feel something subtle, long forgotten, trembling inside me. "Mom, did you know Sarah was going to move in with me?" I asked, hoping that at least someone would say, "No, of course it's a misunderstanding," but she didn't. "Of course, honey, Sarah and I talked about this last week. She's having a hard time, and you have everything you need to help. You know you should be happy, you're a family, and the kids need peace and stability right now." I closed my eyes, trying to keep my composure. "But Mom, I never agreed to this. I have a job, I need space, quiet. I can't just start taking care of 2 kids. My words were drowned out by the silence. Mom's voice became colder. "Judy Elizabeth, I'm disappointed. Your sister is going through a hard time. Family helps family. These kids need you, and you're being selfish." The guilt hit me so hard that I couldn't help but look at Jake and Tommy, who were standing by the stairs with backpacks in their hands and wide-eyed, and here it was, a blow to the most painful place. I felt my throat tighten, a lump rise in my throat. I handed the phone to Sarah without saying another word. I had already lost. "See, it's all settled," Sarah said, smiling, as if we'd simply chosen where we were going on vacation. "Don't worry, Judy, we'll stay for a couple of months, until I find a real job, get a better place, maybe even hire a nanny for the boys." I doubted every word, but what could I say when the kids were already here, the boxes in the living room, and the parents were clearly on her side? "Okay," I breathed, trying to maintain some kind of grounding, "but we have to set some rules." Sarah nodded immediately, easily, without resistance. "Absolutely, we won't get in your way, I promise." Now I realize I should have known that promise would never be kept. But at first, things weren't as bad as I expected. The first weeks were surprisingly calm. Sarah did try. She had a part-time job somewhere in retail, and she left in the mornings, picked the boys up after school around 3, cooked dinner, did her laundry, kept their bedroom tidy. I could hear their footsteps downstairs while I worked in my office, but they were quiet, didn't bother me unnecessarily. Jake and Tommy seemed to understand that their aunt needed time and space to work. Sometimes, though, they would pop into my office, knock softly, open the door a crack, and ask with shy smiles for help with math or to show me their homework. It was sweet, almost nice. I'd forgotten how genuinely inquisitive and intelligent children could be when they weren't screaming or crying or arguing about something stupid. Sarah behaved properly, like a guest who knew her boundaries. And even though there was a lingering sense of unease inside me, I was beginning to relax a little. When my parents came in for Sunday dinner, the atmosphere in the house was like a scene from a cozy family movie, where everyone was smiling, the smell of casserole was in the air, and children's laughter flowed through the rooms like a babbling brook. Mom and Dad were surprisingly animated, dressed a little more than usual, as if this was not just a dinner at their daughter's, but some kind of event. Dad, sitting down at the table, patted me on the shoulder with that approving gesture that used to be rare. "Judy, you're such a great sister," he said with a satisfied smile, nodding towards Sarah and the boys. "Look how everyone gets along, it's wonderful." Mom, standing at the entrance to the living room, watched Jake and Tommy enthusiastically playing video games, and her voice sounded soft, almost affectionate. "The boys seem really happy here, they've been missing the stability." Sarah, sitting across the dinner table from me, was beaming, her smile wide and serene, and as I looked at her, I found myself thinking that everything really did look fine. "Judy's amazing," she said to my parents. "I can't imagine how we'd have managed without her." And, frankly, at the time, I was doing pretty well. This temporary arrangement, however forced, was surprisingly bearable. Sarah seemed genuinely trying to find a new, more stable job, and the boys were going to school, bringing home good grades, and generally not causing too much trouble. I could still focus on work, albeit with some compromises, and life, though louder and busier, was still manageable. But as those 2 months passed, subtle changes began to coalesce into a disturbing pattern. It started with little things. Sarah, who used to get home around 5, suddenly started staying late. At first, she would just call or text, explaining that she needed to stay a little longer at work. And she would sound like she was mildly annoyed about it herself. "Judy, I'm staying a little longer today," she announced one morning, holding a cup of coffee while I sat at my laptop. "My manager said I might get a promotion if I show initiative." I nodded, not looking up from my screen. "That's good, more money, right?" "Exactly," she said, quickly putting on her shoes. "But I need you to pick up the boys from school, until I figure out how to work this out." I froze. "Sarah, you know I have meetings during the day. I can't just drop everything every time. Please, this is temporary. If I get promoted, I can hire a nanny," she said with an intensity that brooked no argument, and so I began picking up the kids. At first, it wasn't so bad. I'd juggle my schedule, finish my code around 2:30, drive to elementary school, stand in a pointless, slow-moving line of parents for 20 minutes, then drive the boys home. They'd sit at the kitchen table with their notebooks while I tucked my laptop under my arm and tried to squeeze a few more hours of productivity out of the rest of the day. But soon, I was responsible for dinner. Sarah was gone, and the kids couldn't live on cereal and fruit alone. I started cooking again. Something simple but filling, sometimes casseroles, sometimes macaroni and cheese, or chicken thighs with veggies. Sarah, on the other hand, started coming in later and later, first at 7, then at 8, sometimes at 9, and she always had an explanation: inventory, new deliveries, training new kids. She'd eat the leftovers, throw her bag on the couch, and go straight upstairs. No apologies, no thanks. Weekends became even harder. Sarah would disappear on Saturday mornings, saying something vague about things to do in town or meeting a friend, and not return until Sunday evening, and I was left alone with 2 energetic boys who needed attention, exercise, games, walks, answers to 1,000 questions, and help with all their projects. I took them to the park, to the library, to a pizza place, listened to endless stories about school, and helped them build pillow castles when all I wanted was silence and a couple of hours on my project. My patience was wearing thin. More and more often I found myself thinking that I wasn't just tired. No, it was an irritated, dull tiredness, bordering on despair. And one day, on a normal weekday evening, I decided that I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I didn't bring up the conversation casually, I didn't send messages, I just decided to wait for her to come back and talk face to face. I sat in the dark living room, with the lights out, in silence, listening to the sounds of the night. First it was 9, then 10, the hands of the clock crawled, but I didn't move. The boys had long since fallen asleep, curled up in their beds, and I, tense as a string, sat and waited. Finally, around midnight, I heard a car slowly pull up, a door slam, a key turn in the lock, the door swung open, and I immediately knew that something was wrong. Sarah was drunk, so much so that she could barely stand up, her movements were awkward, her hair was disheveled, her face was strangely flushed, and she smelled noticeably not of wine or tequila, but of someone else's men's cologne, sharp and heavy. "Sarah, we need to talk," I said, and she jumped, not expecting to see me in the semi-darkness. "Judy? What are you doing here?" she muttered, looking around uncertainly. "Waiting for you. I need to know what's really going on. Are you really working overtime or just having fun with men?" Her face changed before my eyes. There was no trace left of the ostentatious friendliness she had worn with her parents. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashed with irritation. "I'm arranging my personal life. I'm allowed to. By the way, I've been divorced for 2 years," she said through gritted teeth. "But you lie to me about your job, you leave your kids with me, and you get drunk and disappear on weekends." I raised my voice, feeling my anger growing. "Okay, Judy, I don't need to explain anything to you," she snapped, turning and heading upstairs, leaving me sitting there in the dark with a pulsing anger and a strange sense of betrayal. After that fight between Sarah and me, which I still replayed in my head like a broken record, our relationship had completely deteriorated, and if before everything looked like a shaky truce, now everything had collapsed completely. Sarah stopped even pretending to be involved in her children's lives. She began to come home later and later, each time with bleary eyes, in wrinkled clothes, and almost always tipsy, and sometimes just drunk, with an unsteady gait, with the smell of someone else's cologne and cheap wine. And if at first she had at least pretended to care about the boys, asking how their day was or putting a sliced apple in their lunch boxes, now even that routine care was gone. I did everything. And if at first it had been a compromise, a temporary sacrifice I made for the sake of my family, now I realized, this had become my new reality. I picked up the kids from school every day, listened to the teachers, helped with homework, checked spelling, delivered macaroni and cheese to plates, read them bedtime stories, and then sat with them while they fell asleep, holding Tommy's hand because he had bad dreams. On weekends we did crafts, went to the library, walked along the waterfront, and, of course, washed the floors, folded the laundry, and made soup, because even in the game of family, someone had to be an adult. The turning point came unexpectedly, as all true turning points do. One afternoon my phone rang, and the voice on the other end was quiet, polite, and a little embarrassed. "Hello, Ms. Judy? This is Mrs. Chin, Jake's teacher. We'd like to invite you to a parent-teacher conference to discuss his current math grades and overall academic performance." I exhaled and promised to pass the message on to Jake's mother. The next morning, as Sarah and I stretched in the kitchen, me with a cup of coffee, her swigging the last of her orange juice, I said, "Jake has a conference with Mrs. Chin next week. You need to go." She frowned, not even looking up from her phone. "Can't you go?" "I'm busy. This is going to be a busy day." I kept my cool and replied, "Sarah, I'm not his mother. This is your responsibility." She shrugged. "You're better at school. Honestly, you work with him every night. Just go, please." And I went. At the parent-teacher conference, I sat at my desk, clasping my hands, feeling like an imposter, like I was playing a role I hadn't signed up for. I nodded, pretending to be a caregiver, while Mrs. Chin went on about how Jake was distracted sometimes, how he was a smart boy but seemed a little lost, and I nodded, agreed, pretended to know how to help him. It was humiliating, because I knew I wasn't the one hearing it. That night, I called my mom. My voice was shaking with exhaustion. "Mom, Sarah doesn't take care of her kids anymore. She goes out, gets drunk, is barely home, and I do everything. This is not what we agreed on." There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "Judy, honey, your sister is just trying to get her personal life together. She's still going through a divorce. She needs time to get over it." I paused for a moment, stunned. "You call this recovery, Mom? She's drunk every night, and I am raising her kids alone." "You're exaggerating," she said, gently reproaching. "Sarah deserves some happiness. Just try to be patient." I hung up and sat in silence for a long time, feeling the loneliness and helplessness wash over me. Even the boys were starting to notice. One morning, as we were getting ready for school, Tommy asked shyly. Aunt Judy, why doesn't Mom live with us now? I didn't know what to say. I smiled as best I could and said Mom was just too busy, but something inside me snapped. Jake became silent, as if he had withdrawn into himself. He sat with his nose in his notebook, playing alone, not arguing, not being capricious, and this is what scared me most. And Sarah continued to pretend that everything was the same. When she showed up at home, she acted as if she was the hostess and I was the guest. She ate what I cooked, sorted out the food I bought, left the dirty dishes in the sink, without saying a word of gratitude, as if I existed only to serve her and the children. The boys, in fact, lived like orphans with a living mother. The most painful thing was to see how they reached out to her, trying to catch her attention at least a little. They brought her drawings, enthusiastically told her about the past day, with hope in their voices, with this childish naive faith that she would hear, and she waved me off. She said that she was tired, that later, that she had no time. I saw the light go out in their eyes. One day I was working in my office, in the middle of a complex programming section, focused to the limit, when suddenly there was a terrible sound downstairs. Something heavy crashed to the floor, followed by a scream, shrill, childish, frightened. At that moment my heart jumped to my throat so sharply and so strongly that it seemed to be beating not in my chest, but in my head itself, deafening me with anxiety, and I rushed down the stairs as fast as I could, almost sliding down, because from the sound I heard it became clear something had happened, and it was not just a book or a child's toy falling, but something much more serious. When I burst into the living room, the scene that greeted me froze me for a second. Tommy was leaning on the edge of the couch, next to my antique vase, which was now in shards on the floor, crying, clutching his leg, blood seeping through the fabric of his jeans. Slowly but surely, I rushed to his side, kneeling down and instinctively grabbing his shoulders to keep him from falling. "What happened, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, although everything inside was shaking. Jake, standing a little further away and noticeably pale, said almost in a whisper, We were just playing tag." Tommy ran, didn't notice the table. A vase fell on his foot. I carefully lifted my pant leg, and what I saw made me suck in a sharp breath. A deep, jagged gash on his shin, from which blood continued to flow. It was obvious that this was a medical emergency. "Okay, guys," I said, trying to hold on, "we need to get to the hospital right away." I grabbed a clean kitchen towel, wrapped it tightly around Tommy's leg, trying to stop the bleeding, then with difficulty helped him limp to the car, and Jake, still with a frightened look on his face, silently climbed into the back seat. The emergency room at the hospital was a frenzy, with someone moaning in the corner, someone arguing with a nurse, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and tension. Tommy was crying and shaking in pain. Jake was sitting next to him, looking around in fear, and I was struggling to fill out paperwork without any legal status as his guardian. "Are you his mother?" the nurse asked. "No. I'm his aunt," I said, watching as he squeezed my hand. "What about his mother?" "At work," I lied, the lie leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. Time dragged on, like a stretched rubber band. An hour, two, before Tommy was finally called in for an examination, and the doctor, frowning, informed him that the cut was deep and would require a few stitches, but that he would be fine. He was given pain medication, a neat bandage, and given a packet of instructions. When we got home it was around 6 o'clock and I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The boys were quiet, tired, and still a little rattled, and I made them warm grilled cheese sandwiches and put on a quiet cartoon, and they huddled together on the couch, as if trying to warm up from what had just happened. Sarah arrived earlier than usual, around 8, and as soon as she opened the door and saw Tommy's bandaged leg, her face twisted. "What the hell happened to him?" she demanded. Without even saying hello, I explained everything as calmly as I could, how it had happened, how I had driven them to the hospital, how Tommy had gotten his leg stitched up. I hoped she would run to her son, hug him, ask how he was feeling. Instead, Sarah flared up like a dry match. "You weren't keeping an eye on them. It's your fault, Judy. You let my child get hurt." Her voice was sharp and accusing. I stood up and looked her in the eye. "Sarah, I was in my office. The boys were just playing in the living room. It was an accident that wouldn't have happened if you'd been watching them," she yelled. "Are you kidding?" I couldn't hold back anymore. "You're never around. I take care of your kids for months while you—" I hesitated for a second. while you get drunk every night. I work a lot," she snapped, "to support my kids." "Bullshit, you don't work, you go on dates, come home smelling of booze and men's cologne, and expect me to live with it and raise your kids for you." At that moment, I felt something irreversible creeping up on me, as if the brakes had finally been pulled off in this fight. The boys sat silently on the couch, Jake's eyes full of fear, and Tommy, pressed against the pillow, cowered. I knew they could hear everything, but it was too late to stop. "You're a terrible mother, Sarah," I said. Breaking down, "You don't care about Jake and Tommy, you just want a free babysitter so you can sleep around." And the next moment, I felt a sharp pain. Her palm hit me in the face with all its force, and everything around me seemed to freeze for a moment. I stood there dumbfounded, my cheek burning and my vision blurring, then slowly looked up. "Get out," I said quietly but firmly, "get out of my house, now. I'm done with this, you can't kick us out," she snapped. "We have nowhere to go, that's not my problem anymore, you have until tomorrow. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." She laughed, short and angry, with that nasty edge that grated on the ear. "You won't do that, think about how it'll affect the boys." And she was right, and we both knew it. I looked at Jake and Tommy, still huddled together on the couch, that look of horror on their faces that I'd never forget. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking, "but you're leaving tomorrow." "I mean it, Sarah." She just chuckled, without saying a word, turned and went upstairs, leaving me downstairs, surrounded by silence, awareness, and heartache. The next morning was overcast and gray, as if even the sky sensed that the day was going to be tough. It was Saturday, a day when most people take a break, when they can indulge in a lazy breakfast and leisurely read the newspapers, but not me. I was standing by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, my hands wrapped around the hot ceramic, trying to feel warmth and peace for at least a moment, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah came down fully dressed, in jeans and a formal jacket, with her hair pulled back and with some kind of pile of papers in her hands. There was something deliberate, businesslike, but at the same time secretly triumphant in her gaze. "Where are you going?" I asked, turning around. She only threw out, "I'm leaving, I'll be back later," and didn't even look at the boys, who were still asleep in their room. No kiss, no good morning, no motherly gesture. She just walked out the door, as if we were strangers to her, not family. I spent the morning in a kind of mechanical rhythm, sweeping up the remains of the broken vase that I still found in the corners of the room, playing with Jake and Tommy, folding laundry, ironing shirts. I tried to smile, to be an island of calm in this storm for them, to hide from them the anxiety that was building in my chest. I thought that if I behaved as usual, they would feel safe. Sarah returned around noon. She walked in as if nothing had happened, but the look on her face, that strange, triumphant half-smile, immediately made me wary. She held the same papers she had left with, and coming up to me, without preamble, said, "We need to talk." I turned to face her slowly, not expecting anything good. "What is this?" I asked, looking at the papers in her hands. "Medical records from the hospital, about your visit with Tommy yesterday," she said with exaggerated calm and straightened up, like a prosecutor in court. "I'm going to file a police report against you for child abuse." It felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, and for a second I stopped breathing. "You, what? Sarah, are you crazy?" My voice broke, and I almost dropped the cup. "I'll say you threw the vase at Tommy's foot on purpose, because you want to get rid of us, so that we'll leave." "That's ridiculous, it was an accident, the camera recorded it, you know," I replied, feeling my hands begin to shake with rage. But Sarah didn't stop, her smile grew wider, angrier. "I've already talked to the boys, I told them what to say if they asked us." I turned sharply to the door and saw Jake and Tommy standing in the doorway, scared, confused, and with fear in their eyes. I felt myself shaking. "You're going to teach your children to lie to the police? You're manipulating them when they're scared? That's horrible, Sarah, you're sick." She cocked her head to the side, as if she were looking at me from a new angle. "I'll back down, if you let us stay here, and you wire me $50,000. I stared at her, speechless. My own sister was blackmailing me. You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to give you that kind of money." She shrugged, as if this were a mundane transaction. "Well, then I'm filing a complaint, and then we'll sort it out in court." I felt my fingers dig into my mug, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "Okay, but first, I'm going to call Mom and Dad. I want them to hear what you're planning." "Call them," she chuckled, they'll still be on my side, they always have, I did. I invited my parents over for dinner, telling them we needed to have a serious talk about Sarah's future, but I didn't tell them about the blackmail over the phone. It had to be in front of them, so they could hear it from her in person. While we waited, I went up to my office and logged into my security cloud. I knew there was a camera in the living room, embedded in a lamp in the corner of the room, discreet but reliable. I quickly found the file I needed, a recording from yesterday. It showed the boys playing tag, Tommy running past a table, his shoulder hitting the edge, a vase falling, breaking, and him falling, clutching his leg. There was no hand there. No hand of mine, no one else's. It was all crystal clear, an accident. I also watched several recordings of Sarah coming home, drunk, barely able to stand, tripping over a rug, once almost falling in the hallway. I saved it all to a flash drive and put it in my pocket. Around 5 o'clock, my parents' car pulled up. They walked into the house, and I could tell right away that they were annoyed. Dad was sighing, Mom was frowning, as if she already knew this was going to be an unpleasant conversation. "Judy, what's the meaning of this?" Dad began, taking off his jacket. "We had plans tonight." I took a deep breath. "We need to discuss Sarah's living arrangements," I said, trying to sound calm, feeling my insides boiling. Mom immediately went into a defensive posture, folding her arms over her chest. "If you're trying to kick your sister out, Judy, then I'm absolutely horrified by you. You're being cruel, and I'm very, very disappointed. Please sit down. Both of you," I said, and there was such a steely tension in my voice that even Mom was momentarily taken aback. We gathered in the living room, where the air was taut as a string, and it seemed as if even the walls were listening to what was about to happen. Sarah sat on the couch with a smug, almost defiant smirk, as if she already knew that she would get away with it, that no one would believe my words, that she could play it all out again. The boys were upstairs, and I had insisted that they stay in their room, silently praying that they wouldn't hear everything that was going to be said. "Mom, Dad," I began, trying to keep my voice level even though everything was seething inside. "Sarah is blackmailing me." Mom sat back, her expression changing to a mixture of shock and irritation. "Judy, how can you? It's horrible to say that about your sister." I kept my words straight. "She threatened to file a child abuse report against me if I didn't let her live here forever and wire her $50,000. Sarah jumped up, her voice shaking, as if she had been rehearsing this part in advance. "She's lying. She beat up Tommy last night, and now she's trying to twist it to make me look mean and cruel. Sarah punched me in the face last night," I continued, keeping my voice low, "and she comes home drunk most nights while I'm the only one with her kids, feeding them, putting them to bed, helping them with their homework." Dad shook his head and sighed heavily. "Judy, you've always been dramatic. Sarah just needs time to get back on her feet. You need to be more tolerant." "She's not getting back on her feet, Dad. She's a burden," I replied. "I do everything from school trips to laundry, cooking, cleaning, parenting, and she goes on dates, drinks, and comes home late at night." Mom snorted. "She went through a divorce. You need to be more understanding." Sarah quickly chimed in. "Judy never understood what I went through. She just wants to get rid of us. That's why she's making up stories." I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over to my laptop, which I had laid out on the table in advance. "I'm not making this up, and I can prove it." I inserted the flash drive, the screen lit up, and I pressed play. The first video was a recording from the living room camera. The boys were running around, playing tag. Tommy crashed into the table, a vase fell, and he screamed. Everything was clearly visible. It was an accident. There was no indication that I was anywhere near at the time of the incident. The tension was reflected on my parents' faces. Sarah, sitting on the couch, began to turn pale. "Judy, where did you get this?" she whispered. "I have security cameras all over the house, ever since I moved here 3 years ago." I answered calmly. "Were you spying on us?" Her voice became shrill, almost hysterical. "This is my home, Sarah, and as it turns out, it's a good thing I have cameras, because they caught your lies." I clicked on the next video. It showed Sarah staggering into the house around 1 a.m., tripping, crashing into a wall, taking off her shoes, and struggling to get into the bedroom. "It's Tuesday, you said you worked late." I clicked on another one. Sarah walked into the house around midnight on a Friday, wearing a short skirt, swaying, and smelling like cheap perfume, even through the screen. "And it's Friday. You said you were on industrial training." Dad stared at the screen, his mouth open. In disbelief, Mom looked like she'd been slapped. Sarah, Mom finally said, almost whispering to her daughter, is that true? You lied about working? Sarah paused, trying to process something, then mumbled, it's not like you think, I work, sometimes, and then I go out somewhere, to relax. It's not a crime, to relax? I turned sharply to her, every night? While your children are here with me, wondering where their mother is? While Tommy asks why you never kiss him goodnight and why you forget about parent-teacher conferences. This is what you call relaxation? I wasn't going to stop. What about blackmail, Sarah? Do you really think I'll forget how you demanded money and threatened to file a false police report? I didn't say I'd file a false charge, she quickly interjected, but her voice was treacherous. Yes, I did, and you know it. You were going to say that I deliberately threw the vase at Tommy, and you've already told the boys that they should repeat your lie. Everyone fell silent. The air became so thick that it seemed like you could cut it with a knife. In that silence, I could hear my heart pounding and see my mother slowly closing her eyes, as if trying to erase it all from her memory, and Dad looked between me and the screen, unable to accept that everything he had believed, that Sarah was simply temporarily incapacitated, had turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. Dad rose slowly from his seat, his face grim and his eyes tired, as if years had suddenly settled on his shoulders that had never been visible before. He looked at Sarah long and searchingly, as if he were hoping to catch some shred of remorse in her face, some hint of an explanation, but when he found none, he said quietly but firmly, Sarah, did you really threaten to make false accusations against Judy? Sarah lifted her chin, trying to maintain her pride, but her voice was shaking with desperation. I was trying to protect my children. Dad's eyebrows shot up. Protect them? From what? From their aunt, who, by the way, took better care of them than you did. Mom buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She was crying, and it wasn't the kind of cry that held hope, but the bitter, broken sob of a woman who realized that her daughter was not a victim, but the cause of trouble. Sarah, how could you do that? How could you lie to us? How could you use your sister like that? She asked, and there was more pain in her voice than anger. Sarah turned to them, her eyes full of tears, but still stubborn. You don't understand. I needed help, I needed time, to figure things out, to come to my senses. I couldn't help myself, getting drunk every night and ignoring your own children? That's not the path to understanding, Sarah, that's the path to ruin. It wasn't a crisis, it was selfishness. Dad sat up straight. Judy, what do you want us to do? His voice was tired, but there was respect for my right to decide. I looked at them both, then at Sarah, and said calmly, but with a strength I hadn't felt before, I want Sarah and the kids out today. If she tries to file a false report against me, I'm taking the video to the police. What's more, I'm filing for custody of Jake and Tommy. Sarah gasped as if I'd hit her. You can't. You have no right to take my kids away from me. I kept my eyes on her. Look at me, Sarah. I have hours of footage of you coming home drunk after your kids were long asleep. I have footage of you threatening to blackmail me. Any judge would see that those kids don't just need a roof over their heads, they need a stable home where they're loved and cared for. Sarah screamed, you can't be serious. My mother looked at me and, to my surprise, said quietly, I think she is very serious. Sarah, you're a bad mother, and I won't let you use Judy anymore. That's enough. Sarah began to cry, loudly, theatrically, fake-soundingly, the way she had done before when she wanted to buy herself off with emotion. Please, Judy, forgive me. I'll make it right. I promise. I stood there, clasping my hands, because part of me still wanted to believe that she could change, but the other part of me, the part that hadn't slept for months raising her children, knew the truth. It's too late, Sarah, you've had enough time, and all you did was make it worse. Dad intervened, trying to mediate. Judy, think about it. These are your nephews, Jake and Tommy. Think about what's best for them. I looked him straight in the eye. I'm thinking about them. They need a mother who actually cares, not one who sees them as a burden. I can't be everything to them, Dad, and I shouldn't. Then I looked at Sarah, who was still curled up on the couch, sobbing, and said with icy calm, you have 2 hours to pack your things and leave, if you're not out the door by 8 o'clock this evening. I'm calling the police and handing over the video. Mom and Dad exchanged a hard, silent look, and finally Mom said quietly, Sarah, maybe you should stay with us for a while. until you figure this out properly." Sarah's answer was swift and sharp as a whip. "I'm not coming to your place, your house is tiny, I won't fit in there." Dad seemed to lose his patience for the first time that evening. "Then you can't stay here." "Judy's right, things have gone too far." Sarah looked at each of us, her face growing angry, but there was no longer a fight in her eyes, only the knowledge that the game was lost. She turned and thundered upstairs to gather her things. My parents left soon after, without saying goodbye or looking me in the eye. Their silence was everything: shame, embarrassment, the inability to change what had happened. I felt sorry for them, really, but not enough to change my mind. Sarah and the kids left around 7:30. Jake and Tommy came up to me and hugged me tightly, like they didn't want to let go, and that was the hardest thing, looking into their eyes and knowing that I couldn't save them, that it wasn't my role. I held them close and whispered to each, "You're strong, everything will be okay." Then the door closed behind them. A few months passed, and one day I overheard from my cousin that Sarah was now working full-time, got a job in an office, and was really pulling the strings because Mom and Dad weren't letting her drink and let things slide anymore. And, surprisingly, for the first time in a long time, she had to really take care of the kids. The house became quieter without the boys, almost unusual, but it was my silence again, a silence I could breathe in. I could work again, eat whatever I wanted, not think about school trips and nightly tantrums. Sometimes, of course, I felt guilty, remembering Jake bringing me drawings, or Tommy falling asleep clutching my hand, but I reminded myself over and over again, I'm not their mother, that's Sarah's responsibility, and maybe now she'll finally understand what it means to be an adult, and be the mother they deserve.